People no longer bound by their non-disclosure agreements? What can you now disclose? Part 2. I had to sign an NDA to be cast in a pretty big movie this year with a bunch of Marvel people. I know literally nothing of any value to everyone. All I did was dress up and stand out in the snow, staying perfectly still and freezing my ass off next to Tom Holland for a week. Spider-Man 3, Winter Spider confirmed. I once had to sign an NDA to get a price on a printer for my sign shop. This was a printer that was only sold by one distributor, by the way, so there wasn't even any direct competition on this particular model. I think their gimmick was that if they make a really big deal out of giving you this super secret pricing, that you'd be lulled into thinking it was really something special. They weren't worried about you going to a different supplier, they wanted to be able to offer different prices to different customers. This is a concept called price discrimination and is a very common practice. We reused buffet-style food served in a cafeteria that we were supposed to compost and record as waste. The health inspector says anything that's left open buffet-style and serve yourself can't be taken back and repurposed because it's not monitored and could be cross-contaminated or many other things. Nobody should ever eat buffet-style if avoidable, FYI. But the Fortune 500 company I was working for was unhappy about the money they were losing by composting the food. So they made us keep it and reserve it later or repurpose it into soup or casserole or something. Personally, I never did this and just waited for my boss to leave and compost the food, but others I worked with were too worried about losing their jobs to go against orders. I didn't want to be fired, but felt morally obligated to not feed people food that was meant to be garbage, so I just sneakily tossed it out when nobody was looking because I got paid really well there. We all had to sign NDAs saying we wouldn't tell the media, non-employees about recipes and procedures that covered leftover food and food waste. Eventually, my boss discovered what I was doing, and I stood up to him about not being willing to reuse garbage as food, so we agreed that I just quit because while they could force me not to talk about it, they couldn't actually force me to do something illegal for my job, and I was clearly refusing to do it. You should have just reported them to the health inspector. A non-disclosure agreement can't be used to hide illegal activity, and if it went to court, it would be deemed unenforceable. Sure, they can prevent you from disclosing recipes or procedures, but that can prevent you from reporting violations to the proper authorities. I did in the end after I left. I was pretty young and naive when I held that job and didn't understand the difference in those things as the recipe called for the foods I was reusing, if that makes sense. I'm sure the company did it to confuse people like me at the time. I was asked to sign an NDA to be able to see the magical device they had that was going to change the game for IT services. It was an APU board or case that had the company's logo stamped on it, and it ran PF Sense, aka Do-It-Yourself Router. This magical technology was and is still available for about $150 a unit. I got quite a strange look when I had to explain that their NDA was pointless, as the item was widely available and known. I worked at a gym. And in the showers, there was yellow shampoo and blue body wash and pump dispensers. I found out that the only difference between the two soaps was the color. I had a similar thing. Not NDA bound, but everyone in our office building thought the soap was bronze, until I saw a cleaner filling the dispensers with white soap. Turns out the stainless steel dispensers were rusting from the inside out, so the soap was full of rust. The $100 million electronic component broker that I worked for shafted me out of $900,000 in commissions when I was in my early 20s. They assumed I would not have enough money to fight them in court, and they took their shot. I got a lawyer on contingency, sued them, and took home a $500,000 settlement in 2000. The 20-year NDA recently expired. My graphic designer best friend won my town's Design the Centennial logo contest, despite having never set foot in the town. I worked for the radio station and just did an interview with one of the organizers, where he lamented that there weren't very many entries. So I called my friend and said, "Want in on this?" He said, "Sure." As he lived on the other side of the country at the time, I spent the next day texting him photos of the town for inspiration. Anyway, when he won and they found out he was a professional graphic designer who lived on the other side of the country, they made him and me sign NDAs because the town was afraid people would think they brought in a ringer. I used to do data analysis of revenue management for some big companies. Many companies have no clue about their data or their revenue streams. I'm talking several $1 million of revenue disappearing in the pipeline, and no one knowing what happened with it, or even caring, really. There were multiple times I had to inform clients that we had huge gaps in their costs, and we needed to find the missing numbers somewhere in order to make our final reports correct, and was met with the paraphrased reply, "Just sprinkle the missing costs over the existing one. We just want the final total to be correct." All the companies cared about was if the amount of money they have at the end of the year is higher than at the beginning, and anything that happens in between is inconsequential. I objected at first to my bosses, saying that what we were doing was incorrect, but they said to just do as the client said. In the end, I got disillusioned, and whenever our clients came with requests that made no mathematical or logical sense, I'd just execute as requested and let their analysts figure out later that the analysis they paid 6 figures for was basically nonsense. I didn't care because I had documentation of all of their requests and my objections, which were thoroughly ignored. I had a few cases where clients came back disgruntled several months down the line after some in-house analyst had done a deep dive of their data and came up with objections that I had pointed out months before. I'd usually dig up the relevant emails and clear my name. My choice of action was to tell them to pound sand, but my bosses always bent over backwards for clients, so we'd have to do the cleanup I anticipated. In the end, I learned most of our economy is held together by duct tape and wishful thinking. At most, 10% of people working at big companies are competent and carry the bulk of the work, and rarely are the competent ones the ones in charge. This should be higher up the list. It's scary how incompetent people just guffaw their way into positions of power and really have no idea how to run a business. I used to work in fine dining in Oklahoma City. Cocaine. Cocaine everywhere. I've personally walked in on several NBA players over the years, face down in that white girl. Personally, got to watch Harold Hamm sign his divorce check. $975 million is a whole lot of zeros in a small space. Wild times indeed. Well, this is already public knowledge, and they forgot to have me sign an NDA anyway, but Savannah College of Art and Design's ombudsman, Sophia Bagnoli, the independent person who's supposed to represent students in case of unfair treatment by the school, married one of the school's vice presidents, and is now Sophia Aledo. It's definitely a conflict of interest, but she's still serving as independent ombudsman, and currently refusing to help students get any kind of refund now that all their classes are online, and they don't have access to the expensive equipment their expensive tuition is supposed to be paying for. I had to sign an NDA to work at this tech company, and I'm still waiting to accidentally overhear something cool so I can feel special for knowing something important, but being legally barred from disclosing it. Star Wars Battlefront 2 EA will have microtransactions. The NDA was signed in 2016. I was getting more and more worried as the release date kept getting closer, and then it happened. The backlash was so strong that EA went down in the history books as most downvoted comment in Reddit's history. I think I'm finally ready to let the world know my secret. If you've ever used VeriSite, the loading spinners you see when the report loads aren't waiting for anything. People kept complaining that reports were coming back too fast, so it must not be working right. It doesn't take long to complete a few hundred Google searches simultaneously, so the loading spinner just makes you wait a few seconds longer, so it feels like more is happening. So glad to finally get that off my chest. As a lawyer, I viewed a lot of these in tort settlements. The most common use of the NDA is to keep the award amount quiet, so everyone won't sue the company, hoping to get that sweet, sweet settlement money. In the IT world, it is often that the piece of internal software or system that gives your company an edge is not quite as huge a deal as it seems. Often, it is not much more than a couple of technologies mashed together to automate things in a way nobody else is doing yet. And those things are fiercely guarded. I had cases where people saw stuff in action and tried to replicate it, but could not because they were missing just one small piece. I used to work at a zoo. I've got a few. One day, electricity failed, so the polar bears and wolves were able to break out of their barbed wire compounds. Zookeeper told me this while I was located in a kiosk that was situated right next to both the wolves and polar bears. Yikes! Luckily, they decided to not test the fences that day. A few baboons escaped. Zookeepers had to shoot one and tranquilize the other. Supervisor told me I would be fired immediately if I called the press. Thanks. A Swedish car brand called us to ask if we were willing to rent them a moose for a commercial. We told them, no, we do not rent out our animals. Probably the biggest one. One of our zookeepers saw that they had too much of a certain rat-like species. He was tasked to shoot them, but didn't have the heart, so he released them into the wild, without our supervisors knowing. A few years later, we have reports of these animals actually causing destruction to our dikes. Oops. Had to keep them a secret while working there, but have been working other jobs for a few years now. Used to work as a content marketer. Basically, companies of all sizes and all industries would pay my company money to essentially ghostwrite articles for their websites, ebooks, case studies, white papers, daily blogs, etc. Very, very rarely would we have a writer who was actually an expert in a given area. Most of the time, we just Googled for a few relevant points and some pretty bare-bones research. Then these companies slap someone else's name on it who has a fancy, related background but played no part in creating that content to try and make it look credible. Had some huge companies on our client list who painted themselves as thought leaders in their industries, who actually just had a bunch of underpaid, fresh-from-college writers cranking out thousands of words of content a day, with no real knowledge or training in those fields. Some of them weren't secretive about using our services, but we had a lot of NDA clients who were very concerned about their reputations if people knew how much of their research and written content was created this way. A major higher ed resource company comes to mind, software companies, government cybersecurity, healthcare industries, etc., etc. Popular dog kennel I worked for would have people leave their dogs for long periods of time. Dogs would stop eating. They wouldn't tell the owners this. People would leave beds and special toys and treats for their pet, thinking they'd get these items, a little slice of home. These items would go in a trash bag and it would be set aside. Treats would be thrown out. They used the excuse that it created too much laundry and that having personal items in a dog's kennel made them aggressive and protective over their stuff towards both humans and other dogs. Okay, but no, these are people's pets and they're not wolves. Short of making a Facebook post that no one would see, I had no real way of telling the public and risking some lawsuit because I signed an NDA like a dummy. But I told everyone I knew with a dog to tell other dog owners not to send their dog there. Your dog can't tell what happens when you're not around. Dogs would run into us with their tail wagging because they liked the yard workers, but the conditions overall weren't great. Dogs are so good and loyal. Small spaces and loose regulations on how many dogs you can have at once, it still boils my blood when I drive by. Hopefully, things there are better now. I worked at a dog boarding hotel that did similar things. We would provide these packages that allowed your dog a nice dog bed and toys and extra treats before bed. Most of the time, the dog's beds were taken out because they chew them up. But we couldn't tell the clients that, so they would pay for a service they didn't get.